She held a diamond ring worth $2 million in her trembling, soap-stained hands. She could have sold it. She could have vanished from the city, wiped away her debts, and never scrubbed another floor for the man who broke her heart. Nobody would have found her. In a world of shadows, nobody would have even cared. But Elara made the call. And that single choice, that one defiant act of honesty in a city that crushes the poor, pulled her into the orbit of a man who defines power and danger. Now, she is standing in a room full of the elite, while Dante Salvatore, the most feared name in the underworld, kneels before her with eyes that burn with a promise she can no longer run from. How did a common maid end up holding the heart of a king? Let me take you back to the night it all began. Before we dive into Elara's journey from the gutter to the throne, I want to ask you for a favor. My ex-boss told me I'd never make it as a storyteller. He said nobody cared about underdog tales anymore. But I see you here, and I know he's wrong. I believe that stories about integrity, hidden power, and the moment a bully finally gets silenced deserve to be heard. Help me prove that these stories matter. Smash that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a chapter of this powerful saga. If you've ever been looked down on and want to see Elara get her revenge, give this video a like. And drop a comment below. Are you watching from the United States, the UK, Nigeria, Canada, or Australia? We love our global family. Now let's go back to that cold night at the Salvatore estate. The heavy double doors of the Sterling estate's grand dining room felt more like the gates of a prison than an entryway to luxury. Elara smoothed the front of her starched white apron, her fingers trembling slightly against the coarse fabric. Only a year ago, she had walked these halls as the mistress of the house, her laughter echoing against the marble. Now, she was a shadow in the corner, a common maid tasked with replenishing crystal flutes and staying invisible. The air inside was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and roasted duck, but to Elara, it smelled like suffocating judgment. At the head of the long mahogany table sat Sterling, looking every bit the successful mogul he had stepped over her to become. Beside him, draped in silk that cost more than Elara's yearly wages, was Bianca. More Chardonnay, Elara. And do try to move a bit faster. Some of us actually have places to be, Bianca called out, her voice cutting through the sophisticated murmur of the guests like a jagged blade. She didn't look at Elara's face, she never did. To Bianca, Elara was merely an extension of the silver tray she carried. Elara stepped forward, her head bowed. As she leaned in to pour the wine, she could feel Sterling's gaze on her. It wasn't a look of regret or longing, but one of cold curiosity, as if he were watching a bug struggle under a glass. He had watched her lose her family's home, watched her dignity crumble as the debts piled up, and then he had handed her a mop. "Careful now," Bianca whispered, her eyes suddenly flashing with a predatory gleam. Just as the pale gold liquid reached the rim of the glass, Bianca's hand slipped. With a sharp, practiced jerk of her elbow, she sent the full crystal glass reeling. The wine didn't just spill, it erupted, soaking into the front of Elara's pristine white apron and staining the dark fabric of her uniform beneath. The table went silent. Elara gasped, the cold liquid seeping through to her skin, but it was the heat of humiliation that burned the most. "Oh, for heaven's sake!" Bianca cried out, her voice rising in a theatrical display of shock that quickly dissolved into a sharp, mocking laugh. "Look at you. You're even clumsier as a servant than you were as a wife, Elara. Honestly, Sterling, where did you find this girl?" "Oh, that's right. She came with the house, didn't she?" A few of the guests chuckled uncomfortably, while others simply stared. Bianca leaned back, her diamonds catching the light of the chandelier as she gestured wildly at the stain. "Look at that mess. It suits you really. Stained, common, and utterly out of place. You can scrub the floors all you want, honey, but you'll never wash off the smell of poverty." Elara's breath hitched. She could feel the tears pricking at the corners of her eyes, hot, stinging tears of a woman pushed to her absolute limit. She looked to Sterling, a desperate, final plea for a shred of humanity in his eyes. Sterling merely took a slow sip from his own glass and looked away. "Clean it up, Elara," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. "And get out. You're ruining the atmosphere." The laughter followed her as she retreated. Bianca's voice trailed after her, loud and shrill, ensuring the entire room heard the final blow. "Don't cry on the rug, dear. Salt water ruins the wool, and you certainly can't afford to replace it." Elara stumbled into the kitchen. The swinging doors muffled the sounds of the elite, but they couldn't shut out the ringing in her ears. She leaned against the cold, industrial sink, her hands over her mouth to stifle a sob. She was a nobody. She was a common maid. The world had decided her value was zero. She reached into her pocket to find a cloth to dab at her ruined uniform, but her fingers brushed against something else. A small, velvet pouch she had found earlier that evening while cleaning the guest wing. She pulled it out, the weight of it heavy in her palm. She opened the drawstring, and for a moment, the dim kitchen light was swallowed by a brilliance she had never seen before. A ring. Massive, intricate, and radiating a dangerous, cold beauty. It was worth a fortune. It was worth 1,000 of the insults Bianca had just hurled at her. It was a ticket out of this hell. As she stared into the depths of the diamond, the tears on her cheeks dried. The mocking laughter of the elite still echoed from the dining room, but for the first time in a year, Elara didn't feel like a maid. She felt like a woman holding the power to burn their whole world down. She didn't know then that the ring didn't belong to a guest. It belonged to a man who was currently watching the estate from the back of a black sedan, a man who was tired of people who laughed at the honest, and who was about to show Elara exactly what she was worth. The rain had turned from a drizzle into a relentless downpour by the time Elara reached the outskirts of the city. The towering iron gates of the Salvatore estate loomed out of the mist like the teeth of a sleeping giant. Even the air here felt different, heavier, charged with a silent, lethal authority that made this Sterling mansion look like a dollhouse. Elara clutched the velvet pouch tightly in her pocket, her knuckles white. Every instinct told her to run, to sell the diamond and flee the country, but the memory of Bianca's mocking laughter acted as a strange anchor. She wouldn't let them be right about her. She wasn't a thief. She pressed the intercom button, her breath hitching as a cold, mechanical click signaled a connection. "I'm here to return something," she whispered into the rain. "Something that belongs to Mr. Salvatore." There was a long, suffocating silence before the massive gates groaned open. Elara walked up the winding driveway, her soaked maid's uniform clinging to her skin, a stark contrast to the sprawling limestone fortress that awaited her. At the entrance stood a man who looked less like a servant and more like a blade sheathed in a tailored suit. His hair was slicked back, and his eyes held the weary sharpness of someone who had seen every sin the city had to offer. This was Lorenzo, the consigliere, the right hand to the man the underworld called the king. "You found it," Lorenzo said, his voice a low baritone that didn't hide his skepticism. He didn't reach for the pouch immediately. Instead, he studied Elara, taking in her shivering frame, the stained apron, and the raw honesty in her exhausted eyes. Elara pulled the pouch from her pocket and held it out. Her hand shook, but her gaze remained steady. "It was in the guest wing after the gala. I'm a maid there. I thought he should have it back." Lorenzo took the pouch, opening it just enough to let the $2 million diamond catch the dim light of the foyer. He looked from the gem to Elara, a flicker of genuine shock crossing his normally impassive face. "Do you have any idea what this is worth, Signorina?" he asked, his voice softer now. "You could have disappeared. You could have lived 10 lifetimes on what is inside this pouch. Why come here?" "Because it isn't mine," Elara replied, her voice gaining a sudden, quiet strength. "And I've lost enough already without losing my soul, too." Lorenzo stared at her for a long beat, the silence in the hallway stretching until it felt like a physical weight. "Wait here," he commanded, gesturing toward a marble bench before disappearing into the depths of the house. Elara sat, the water from her hair dripping onto the pristine floor. She felt small and out of place, unaware that she was not alone. In a darkened room upstairs, surrounded by a wall of high-definition monitors, Dante Salvatore sat in a leather chair that felt more like a throne. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing the intricate black ink that spiraled down his forearms, symbols of a life built on grit and iron. He ignored the spreadsheets of his global empire, his eyes fixed entirely on the screen displaying the girl in the foyer. He watched her through the camera's lens, tracing the way she tucked a wet strand of hair behind her ear. He saw the bruise-like shadows of exhaustion under her eyes and the way she held herself with a dignity that shouldn't belong to a woman wearing a servant's rags. He had spent his life surrounded by people who would kill their own kin for a fraction of what was in that pouch. He knew the scent of greed better than he knew the scent of rain, yet this girl, this nobody, had walked into the heart of the lion's den just to do what was right. Honesty, Dante murmured, his voice a dark rasp that vibrated in the quiet room. A slow, dangerous smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a smile of kindness, but of a predator who had just found something incredibly rare and infinitely more precious than a diamond. On the screen, Lorenzo returned to Elara, handing her a small, unmarked envelope, a reward. But Dante wasn't looking at the envelope. He was looking at the way Elara shook her head, refusing the money at first, her pride still intact even in her poverty. Lorenzo, Dante said into the desk intercom, his eyes never leaving Elara's image. Find out everything. Her name, her debts, the man who put those tears in her eyes. I want to know exactly who broke a heart this pure. As Elara walked back down the driveway and into the storm, she felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. She didn't know that the gates closing behind her weren't shutting her out. They were marking the moment she had become the obsession of the most dangerous man in the city. The shadow of Salvatore had fallen over her, and for the first time in her life, she was no longer invisible. The following morning, the world felt inexplicably lighter, though Elara's reality remained draped in the drab gray of her service uniform. She was scrubbing the baseboards of the Sterling Estate's West Wing when her phone buzzed with a notification that made her heart stop. It was from the city hospital's billing department. She braced herself for the usual demand for a late payment on her mother's cardiac treatments, but the message was different. It was a formal receipt. Balance, $0. Elara stared at the screen, her vision blurring. Beneath the zeroed-out balance was a brief, typed note. Anonymous philanthropic settlement. She checked it again, then a third time, her breath coming in shallow hitches. The crushing weight that had lived in her chest for years, the debt that had kept her tethered to Sterling's cruelty, had simply vanished into the ether. It felt like a miracle, but as she wiped a stray tear with the back of a soapy hand, she felt a prickle at the back of her neck. The same sensation she'd had at the Salvatore gates. The day only grew more surreal. By afternoon, a courier arrived at the servants' entrance with a large, cream-colored box embossed with the logo of the city's most exclusive boutique, a place where Bianca spent more in an hour than Elara saw in a year. This must be a mistake, Elara said, backing away from the box as if it were a trap. I didn't order anything. I can't even afford the ribbon on that box. The address is correct, Miss Elara, the courier insisted, his face a mask of professional indifference. The order was flagged as an inventory error. The boutique is clearing out stock and sent this as a complimentary apology for a delivery delay on a previous order you never placed. Inside the box, nestled in layers of silk tissue paper, lay a gown the color of midnight. It was a masterpiece of lace and structure, designed to fit a woman who was no longer a shadow. There were shoes, two slender, silver-heeled things that looked like they belonged in a fairy tale. It's just luck, she whispered to the empty staff kitchen, though her voice lacked conviction. Throughout the house, the atmosphere shifted. Sterling's usual sharp barks for service were silenced by a series of frantic phone calls. From her position in the hallway, Elara heard him shouting about a major investor pulling out of his latest venture. Bianca was no better. She was in a hysterics in the parlor because her private club membership had been unexpectedly suspended for an audit. It was as if a giant hand was reaching into their lives, systematically stripping them of the power they used to torment her. Elara felt the shift most acutely when she stepped out onto the servants' balcony to catch a moment of air. The Sterling estate was tucked behind high walls, but across the street, parked in a patch of deep shade, sat a black sedan. Its windows were tinted dark as ink. No one got out. No one moved. It just sat there, a silent sentinel in the cooling twilight. She didn't feel afraid. That was the strangest part. In a city where she had been hunted by debt collectors and humiliated by her own ex-husband, this new, invisible presence felt like a shield. It was a heavy, masculine energy that seemed to pulse from the car, watching over her with a fierce, possessive intensity. She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had returned a $2 million ring. They were still the hands of a maid, red raw from cleaning, but for the first time, they weren't shaking. She realized then that her luck wasn't luck at all. It was a message. Dante Salvatore was not a man of small gestures. He was a man who moved mountains and silenced storms. By paying her mother's bills and sending the dress, he wasn't just rewarding her. He was claiming the territory of her life. He was clearing the path, removing the thorns that Sterling and Bianca had planted in her way, and preparing her for a world she couldn't yet imagine. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the headlights of the black sedan flickered once, a brief, glowing acknowledgement, before the car pulled slowly away from the curb. Elara watched it go, her hand resting over the spot on her chest where her heart was finally beginning to beat with a rhythm that wasn't dictated by fear. She was still a nobody in the eyes of the people inside the mansion, but someone out there in the dark had decided she was worth a kingdom. And that someone was coming for her. The air in the Rusty Spoon was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and cheap floor wax, a far cry from the lavender-scented halls of the Sterling estate. Elara sat in the furthest corner booth, her hands wrapped around a thick ceramic mug as if its warmth could keep her world from spinning. After a week of impossible luck, and the feeling of eyes following her every move, she just needed to be a ghost in a room full of strangers. She looked down at her hands, cleaner now that she wasn't scrubbing baseboards, and sighed, the sound lost in the hum of the overhead neon sign. The bell above the diner door jingled, and the atmospheric pressure in the room seemed to drop. A man walked in, and for a moment, the clatter of silverware and the low drone of the television died away. He was tall, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked like it had been carved out of shadow, but he didn't head for the counter. He walked straight toward her booth with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator who had no need to hurry. "Is this seat taken?" His voice was a dark, low rasp that made the hair on Elara's arms stand up. She looked up, her breath catching in her throat. It was him, the man from the black sedan, the man she had sensed watching her from the darkness of the Salvatore gates. Up close, he was devastating. His jaw was a hard line of granite, and his eyes, a piercing, intelligent hazel, held a depth that made her feel like he could read the very thoughts she was trying to hide. "It's a free country," Elara managed to whisper, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. He slid into the booth across from her, his presence instantly shrinking the space until the rest of the diner ceased to exist. He didn't look like a criminal. He looked like a god who had stepped into the mud just to see what it felt like. On the back of his hand, a glimpse of black ink peeked out from beneath his cuff, a complex, swirling pattern that hinted at a life of violence and secrets. "The coffee here is terrible," he noted, glancing at her mug. "But I suppose it's the quiet people come for." "I just wanted a moment where no one was asking me for anything," Elara said, surprised by her own honesty. "Or mocking me for what I don't have." The man leaned forward, his gaze intensifying. "Those who mock you are usually the ones most afraid of you, Elara. They see something in you they can't buy with their family names or their offshore accounts. They see a soul that hasn't been corrupted yet." Elara froze. "You know my name." "I make it my business to know things that are rare," he replied smoothly. He didn't offer his own name, and strangely, she didn't ask. There was a dangerous, magnetic pull between them, a chemistry so thick it felt like static electricity in the air. He treated her not like a maid, and not like a victim of a messy divorce, but like a lady of high standing. He listened when she spoke about her mother, and he didn't flinch when she mentioned the struggles of her past. For 30 minutes, the most feared man in the city played the part of a gentleman. He told her stories of his travels, to places she had only seen in the glossy magazines Bianca left for trash, and for the first time in years, Elara felt heard. Not seen as a tool or a servant, but truly heard. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked, her voice trembling as he stood to leave. "You don't even know me." He paused, his hand resting on the table inches from hers. The power radiating from him was palpable, a hard protection that felt both terrifying and intoxicating. "I know that you returned a ring that could have changed your life because you believed in the truth," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was meant only for her. "In my world, truth is a death sentence. To find it in a diner at midnight, that makes you the most interesting person in this city." He reached out, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a gesture that was both a caress and a claim. The touch sent a jolt of heat through her entire body. "Sleep well, Elara," he said. "The world is going to look very different when you wake up." As he walked out, the diner seemed to grow colder, the light dimmer. Elara watched through the window as he stepped into the waiting black sedan, the engine purring like a large cat. She didn't know his name was Dante Salvatore, and she didn't know he was the Mafia king who was currently dismantling Sterling's life piece by piece. All she knew was that for the first time since her world had collapsed, she felt safe. And that was the most dangerous feeling of all. The walls of the Sterling estate, once symbols of impenetrable wealth, now seemed to vibrate with a frantic, desperate energy. Sterling's office, usually a sanctuary of cold calculations and expensive cigars, had become a war room of shattered nerves. He paced the length of the Persian rug, his face a sallow mask of panic as he gripped his phone so tightly his knuckles were white. One by one, his primary investors were vanishing. Contracts that had been ironclad for a decade were being torn up overnight, replaced by icy, one-sentence emails citing restructuring. He didn't know that in high-rise offices across the city, the name Salvatore was being whispered in terrified tones. He only knew that someone was systematically cutting his oxygen supply, and he was beginning to suffocate. Elara was in the hallway, polishing the brass fixtures of the grand staircase, when the office door swung open with a violent crash. Sterling stood there, his tie loosened and his eyes bloodshot, looking like a man who had seen a ghost. He didn't look at her with his usual condescension. Instead, he looked at her with a hungry, predatory suspicion. "You," he barked, his voice cracking. "In here. Now." Elara set down her cloth, her heart beginning a slow, steady thud. She walked into the office, the air thick with the smell of stale scotch. Sterling slammed the door behind her and leaned over his desk, looming over her in a way that used to make her shrink. But today, the memory of Dante's thumb brushing her knuckles at the diner acted as an invisible shield. She stood her ground. "I know you've been seen, Elara," Sterling hissed, his hands trembling as he shuffled through a pile of surveillance stills on his desk, blurry images of a black sedan and a tall, shadowed figure in a diner booth. "Don't play the innocent martyr with me. You're seeing someone. Someone with more power than a common maid should never be near." "I don't know what you're talking about, Sterling," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. He laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "The Salvatore Syndicate. That's who's doing this. They're squeezing me, Elara. They're buying my debt and freezing my assets. And it started the day you returned that ring." He moved around the desk, his tone shifting from aggression to a sickly, manipulative sweetness. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch feeling like ice. "Look, Elara, we had a life together once. I know things ended poorly, but we're still a team, aren't we? You're in his orbit. You have his ear." "I don't even know his name," she lied, though the name Dante felt like a warm secret in her mind. "Don't lie to me." Sterling's face turned a violent shade of purple. He gripped her arm, his fingers digging into the fabric of her uniform. "You're going to find out what he wants. You're going to tell me what he's planning. If he's infatuated with you, use it. Get me a meeting. Get me a name. If you save my company, I'll make sure you never have to scrub a floor again. I'll give you a settlement that will make your head spin." Elara looked at the man she had once loved, the man who had traded her for a higher social standing and a colder wife. He was pathetic. He was a small man trying to bargain with a world he didn't understand. "You want me to spy for you?" she asked, a spark of cold fire lighting in her eyes. "After you left me with nothing? After you let Bianca humiliate me every single day in this house?" "I'm offering you a way out, Elara," Sterling shouted, his desperation finally breaking through. "If I go down, you go down too. You're still an employee of this estate. If I go bankrupt, your mother's bills don't get paid. Think about her if you won't think about yourself." Elara pulled her arm back with a sharp, decisive motion. She felt a surge of power she had never known, realization that Sterling was no longer the one in control. The mysterious pressure he was feeling wasn't just business, it was a message. Dante was clearing the board, and Sterling was nothing more than a pawn that had outlived its usefulness. "My mother's bills are already taken care of," Elara said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet level. "And for the first time in my life, I don't need anything from you, Sterling. Not your money, and certainly not your mercy." She turned and walked toward the door. Sterling's voice followed her, high-pitched and frantic. "You'll regret this. You're nothing. You're just a common maid playing at a game you can't win. He'll discard you just like I did." Elara didn't flinch. She stepped out into the hallway and closed the door on a shouting. She knew Sterling was wrong. Dante Salvatore didn't discard things that were rare. He protected them. And as she looked out the window at the black sedan parked once again at the edge of the property, she realized that the war wasn't just coming, it was already here. And for the first time, she was on the winning side. The air in the servants' quarters had grown heavy, thick with the scent of impending storm and Bianca's sharpening malice. Bianca had watched from the shadows of the upstairs gallery as Elara moved through the house with a new, quiet grace. The bowed head was gone. In its place was a woman who walked as if she were protected by an invisible phalanx. To Bianca, this shift was an unforgivable sin. She didn't just want Elara to be poor, she wanted her to be broken, discarded, and erased. While the house was quiet in the late afternoon, Bianca slipped into the narrow, dimly lit hallway where the staff kept their few personal belongings. Her silk dress hissed against the cold linoleum, a sound like a snake in the grass. She stopped at the locker marked with Elara's name, her lip curling in a sneer at the simplicity of it. From her pocket, she pulled a heavy platinum necklace dripping with teardrop emeralds. It was a signature piece, one the entire city recognized as a Sterling heirloom. With a flick of her wrist, she tucked it deep into the pocket of Elara's spare uniform, buried beneath a modest book of poetry and a photograph of Elara's mother. "Let's see how your mysterious protector handles a felony," Bianca whispered to the empty room, her eyes gleaming with a manic, jagged light. An hour later, the silence of the estate was shattered by the shrill, rhythmic wail of sirens. Two police cruisers tore up the gravel driveway, their blue and red lights dancing mockingly against the limestone walls. Bianca stood at the top of the grand staircase, a lace handkerchief pressed to her trembling lips in a performance of choreographed distress. "It's gone. My grandmother's emeralds," she wailed as the officers entered the foyer. "I saw her lingering near my dressing room. I didn't want to believe it, but who else could it be? A common maid with nothing to her name. The temptation must have been too much." Elara was brought into the foyer, her hands still damp from the kitchen sinks. She looked at the circle of accusing faces, Sterling, looking on with a mixture of fear and cowardly hope, Bianca, radiating a poisonous triumph, and the officers, their hands resting heavy on their belts. "I haven't taken anything," Elara said, her voice remarkably steady despite the roar of blood in her ears. "Search her locker," Bianca snapped, dropping the facade of the victim for a split second to reveal the predator beneath. "Search it now." The walk to the staff quarters felt like a funeral procession. Elara stood by as an officer clicked open her padlock. He reached inside, shifting her meager belongings until his fingers snagged on something cold and metallic. He pulled it out, the emeralds catching the harsh fluorescent light, casting green, sickly shadows across Elara's pale face. "Is this yours, ma'am?" the officer asked Sterling. "It is," Sterling muttered, refusing to meet Elara's eyes. "No," Elara whispered, the first cracks of true terror appearing in her voice. I've never seen that. I didn't, Bianca, you know I didn't. Bianca stepped forward, her face a mask of cold, righteous fury. What I know is that a thief belongs in a cage. You thought you were special, didn't you? You thought you were rising above us. But at the end of the day, you're just a common criminal in a common uniform. The cold steel of the handcuffs snapped shut around Elara's wrists. The sound was final, a sharp punctuation mark on the life she had tried to rebuild. As the officers began to lead her away, Bianca leaned in close, her breath smelling of expensive gin and malice. No one is coming for you, Elara. Not in a police station. You'll be branded, fingerprinted, and forgotten. This is where your story ends. Elara was marched out into the cold evening air, the gravel crunching under her feet like breaking bones. She felt the weight of the cuffs, the sting of the betrayal, and the crushing realization that Bianca's trap was perfect. But as she was pushed toward the back of the cruiser, she caught a glimpse of something in the distance. At the very edge of the estate's gates, parked in the deepening shadows of the oak trees, sat the black sedan. The engine wasn't running, and the lights were off, but she could feel the gaze from behind the tinted glass. It wasn't the gaze of a bystander. It was the gaze of a judge. Bianca stood on the porch, waving a mocking goodbye, unaware that she had just invited a war she wasn't prepared to fight. She thought she had used the law to destroy Elara, but she had forgotten one thing. Dante Salvatore didn't obey the law. He owned it. And as the cruiser's doors slammed shut, Elara realized that the setup wasn't the end of her story. It was the spark that would finally set Bianca's world on fire. The police cruiser's door was inches from closing when a screech of tires echoed across the Sterling driveway. A fleet of black SUVs, identical and intimidating, swerved onto the lawn, cutting off the path of the patrol cars. The officers froze, their hands hovering over their holsters as a group of men in charcoal gray suits stepped out. They didn't look like thugs. They looked like the men who owned the banks the thugs robbed. At the head of the group was Lorenzo, Dante's consigliere, holding a sleek silver tablet. He didn't look at the police. He looked directly at Sterling and Bianca, who were standing on the porch like royalty watching an execution. "Stop the arrest," Lorenzo commanded, his voice as sharp as a razor. "Step back, sir," the lead officer warned, though his voice wavered. "We have a positive recovery of stolen property. This woman is going to the station." "What you have," Lorenzo countered, stepping into the wash of the cruiser's blue lights, "is a fabricated crime. And what I have is the truth." He turned the tablet toward the officers and the Sterlings. The screen flickered to life, showing a grainy but high-definition feed from a hidden pinhole camera, a device Sterling didn't even know was in his own staff quarters. The footage was time-stamped from 40 minutes prior. On the screen, Bianca's unmistakable silhouette slipped into the hallway. The guests watched in a paralyzed silence as the digital Bianca pulled the emerald necklace from her pocket and stuffed it into Elara's locker with a triumphant, sickly grin. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the wet sob that finally escaped Elara's throat. That's a fake. A deep fake." Bianca screamed, her face contorting into a mask of hysterical rage. She lunged forward, her fingers clawing at the air as if she could tear the digital evidence out of the sky. "Sterling, do something. They're trespassing. They're hackers." Sterling, however, had gone ashen. He recognized the watermark on the corner of the video, a small, stylized S inside a crest. It was the mark of the Salvatore security firm. He realized then that his house hadn't been his own for weeks. Dante hadn't just been watching Elara. He had been bugging the very walls to catch the rats in the act. "The footage has already been uploaded to the precinct's main server," Lorenzo said, his gaze shifting to Bianca with a look of pure disgust. "Along with a formal complaint for malicious prosecution, filing a false police report, and defamation of character. Officers, I suggest you unbind the lady before my employer decides to take an interest in your department's lack of due diligence." The handcuffs were removed with a frantic, fumbling haste. Elara rubbed her wrists, her skin raw and red, as she stepped away from the cruiser. She didn't look at the police, and she didn't look at Sterling. She looked at Lorenzo. "Where is he?" she whispered. "Watching," Lorenzo replied simply. Bianca was vibrating with a fury so intense it seemed to radiate off her in waves. She watched as Elara, the woman she had tried to erase, was escorted toward one of the black SUVs. The common maid was being treated with more reverence than Bianca had ever received in her life. "You think this is over?" Bianca shrieked, her voice breaking into a jagged howl as the police began to turn their attention toward her. "You think you can just take her? She's a servant. She's nothing. I will burn this city to the ground before I let a maid win." She turned on Sterling, slapping him across the face with a force that echoed through the night. "Do something, you coward. They're taking her. They're taking everything." Sterling didn't move. He stood on his porch, a ruined man in a ruined house, watching as the SUVs pulled away. He knew what Bianca was too blinded by rage to see. They weren't just taking Elara. They were taking the soul of the house. Inside the SUV, the air was cool and smelled of expensive leather and cedarwood. Elara sank into the seat, her body finally surrendering to the tremors of the night. She looked out the tinted window as the Sterling estate vanished into the darkness. She had been saved, but she knew the cost. Bianca's humiliation wasn't an ending, it was a transformation. The woman's rage had shifted from a petty jealousy into a cold, murderous obsession. As the car sped toward the heart of the city, Lorenzo's phone chirped. He glanced at the screen and then at Elara. "The master is pleased," he said quietly, "but he wants you to know that the masquerade is in 3 days. He expects you to be ready." Elara nodded, her hand resting on the silk upholstery. She wasn't afraid of the masquerade, and she wasn't afraid of Bianca anymore. She was a woman who had seen the bottom of the abyss and had been pulled back by a king. The war was no longer about a necklace or a ring. It was about the throne, and Elara was finally ready to claim it. The grand ballroom of the Salvatore estate was a sea of shimmering silk and porcelain masks, a gilded cage where the city's elite gathered to worship at the altar of power. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen explosions from the frescoed ceilings, casting a warm, deceptive glow over the guests. For Sterling and Bianca, this was not just a party. It was a final lifeline. Their empire was hemorrhaging, and rumors of their impending bankruptcy had turned them into social pariahs. Their only hope lay in securing a contract with the evening's mysterious host, a man whose face few knew, but whose shadow governed every transaction in the city. Bianca adjusted her lace mask, her fingers twitching with a nervous energy she tried to mask as poise. "He has to see us, Sterling," she hissed, her voice barely audible over the swelling strings of the orchestra. "If we don't get the Salvatore backing tonight, we're finished. I won't go back to being a nobody." Sterling straightened his tuxedo, his face pale and clammy. "Just stay calm. We have a portfolio. We have history. He just needs to see the value." But the room's collective breath suddenly hitched, the music seeming to dip in volume as the grand double doors at the top of the marble staircase swung open. The herald didn't announce a name. He didn't need to. The presence of the woman standing at the landing did the work for him. Elara descended the stairs not as a maid, but as a vision of midnight and starlight. The gown Dante had sent, the one Bianca had mocked as an inventory error, clung to her with a regal elegance that made the other women in the room look like flickering candles next to the moon. A delicate silver masquerade mask, filigreed with diamonds, covered the upper half of her face, leaving only her steady, intelligent eyes and the determined set of her jaw visible. She moved with a grace that was no longer practiced or forced, but innate. Every step was a silent declaration of her survival. As she reached the ballroom floor, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. Whispers followed her like a trail of smoke.
Who is she?
Is she the Salvatore heiress? A foreign princess? Sterling and Bianca stood frozen near the champagne fountain. Bianca's glass trembled in her hand, the liquid sloshing dangerously close to her silk gloves. "It can't be," she whispered, her voice cracking. That's the uniform. The boutique heir. Sterling, look at her face." Sterling was speechless, his mouth hanging open in a silent mask of horror. He recognized the poise, the curve of the neck he had once known, but the woman before him was a stranger. She was radiant, untouchable, and possessed a gravity that pulled every eye in the room toward her. Elara walked directly toward them, her silver heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble. She didn't stop, didn't falter, and didn't offer them the satisfaction of a glance. She passed them as if they were nothing more than the stone pillars holding up the ceiling, insignificant and stationary. "Wait," Sterling blurted out, stepping forward in a desperate, clumsy move that drew the judgmental stares of the surrounding guests. You're the woman from the photographs. You're the one close to him. Please, we need to speak with the host. We have a proposal that..." Elara stopped and turned slowly. Behind the silver lace of her mask, her eyes were cold, reflecting the glitter of the chandeliers like ice. "The host doesn't accept proposals from those who can't recognize true value when it's standing right in front of them," she said, her voice a calm, melodic chime that carried across the immediate circle. Bianca's face contorted, her jealousy finally breaking through her mask of elite sophistication. "You're a maid, Elara. You can put on all the silk in the world, but you'll always be the girl who scrubs my floors. You don't belong here." The room went deathly silent. The insult was a jagged stone thrown into a still pond. Bianca looked around, expecting the crowd to join her in mockery, but she found only looks of profound pity and shock. Before Elara could respond, a heavy, masculine hand settled firmly on her waist. The temperature of the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as Dante Salvatore stepped out of the shadows. He wore no mask. His face was a masterpiece of lethal confidence, his hazel eyes fixed on Bianca with a look that promised a slow and total destruction. "You're right about one thing," Dante said, his voice a dark, velvet growl that vibrated through the ballroom. "She doesn't belong here. She belongs at my side, which means you are currently standing in the space reserved for my guests, and you are no longer invited." He didn't raise his voice, but the finality of it was absolute. As security moved in to escort the trembling Sterlings toward the exit, Elara looked up at Dante. The common maid and the Mafia boss stood in the center of the world's most exclusive stage, and for the first time, Elara realized the masquerade wasn't about hiding who she was. It was about showing them exactly what they had lost. The silence that followed Dante's declaration was heavy, thick with a scent of ozone and expensive perfume. Security teams in shadowed suits materialized from the edges of the ballroom, their movements synchronized and lethal. They stood like a wall of iron between the elite guests and the two people who had just been stripped of their dignity. Bianca's face was a frantic, blotchy red, her chest heaving as she looked around the room, searching for a single ally. But she found only the cold, mirrored surfaces of the ballroom and the even colder eyes of the high society she had so desperately tried to join. "You're making a mistake," Bianca shrieked, her voice cracking as a guard gripped her elbow. "She's a servant. She was scrubbing the grease off my stove a week ago. Dante, you're being played by a common thief." Dante didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge the sound of her voice. His focus remained entirely on Elara, his hazel eyes soft with a reverence that was far more terrifying to his enemies than his anger. He reached out, his tattooed hand gently taking Elara's. His skin was warm, a steady anchor in the middle of the storm. "The only mistake made in this room," Dante said, his voice dropping to a low, melodic rumble that reached every corner of the hall, "was believing that a uniform defines a soul. You looked at Elara and saw a maid because that is all your small mind could comprehend. I looked at her and saw a woman who held a kingdom in her hands and chose honor instead." He reached into the pocket of his charcoal jacket and pulled out the velvet pouch, the very one Elara had returned to his gates on that rainy night. The room held its breath as he opened it, pulling out the ring that had started it all. Under the light of 1,000 crystals, the $2 million diamond erupted in a display of fire and light so brilliant it seemed to blind those standing nearest. Dante sank slowly to one knee. The sight of the city's most feared predator in a position of total submission sent a physical shockwave through the crowd. Sterling let out a strangled, pathetic sound, a whimper of a man who realized he had traded a diamond for a handful of gravel. Elara, Dante whispered, his voice local and intimate. You found this ring in the dust of a house that didn't deserve you. You could have walked away. You could have lived a life of ease and never looked back at the shadows. But you chose the truth. And in my world, truth is the only currency that matters. He took her left hand, his thumb brushing over the raw, red skin of her knuckles, marks of the labor she had endured with her head held high. I don't offer you this ring to save you. I offer it because I am a king who has finally found his queen. Will you rule this city by my side? Elara looked down at him, the tears she had held back through a year of misery finally spilling over. They weren't tears of a victim anymore. They were the tears of a woman who had finally been seen. She looked at the ring, then at the man holding it, and finally at the broken couple being dragged toward the exit. Yes, she whispered, her voice clear and resonant. Yes, Dante. As he slid the massive diamond onto her finger, the $2 million stone caught the light and cast a defiant, shimmering glow across the room. Dante stood and pulled her into his arms, his embrace a promise of absolute protection. Behind them, Bianca let out one final, jagged scream of "she's nothing," as the heavy oak doors finally slammed shut, cutting her off from the light and the luxury forever. Sterling and Bianca were forced out into the cold, rainy night, without their titles, without their fortune, and without a single friend to call. They had entered the night as the elite, and they left it as the nobodies they had always accused Elara of being. In the center of the ballroom, the music began to swell again, a triumphant, soaring arrangement. Dante led Elara into the first dance, the crowd bowing as they passed. The common maid was gone, consumed by the fire of her own integrity. In her place stood the most powerful woman in the city, holding the hand of the man who had burned down a mansion just to build her a throne. The war was over, and as Elara rested her head against Dante's shoulder, she realized that the $2 million ring was beautiful, but it was the man who saw her worth before she wore it that was truly priceless. Honesty as a path to elevation. Elara's decision to return the $2 million ring, at a time when she was most vulnerable, proves that true character is defined by what you do when you think no one is watching. In this narrative, her honesty acts as a filter that separates her from the greedy, status-obsessed elites like Sterling and Bianca. The story highlights that titles like common maid are superficial labels. Bianca and Sterling possess wealth but lack honor, eventually leading to their ruin. Conversely, Elara's internal value remains intact regardless of her uniform, which is ultimately what attracts the protection and respect of a king. It reinforces the just world trope. Those who use their power to humiliate others will eventually be silenced by a higher power, while those who maintain their dignity through suffering will be rewarded with more than they ever lost. Ultimately, the story suggests that who you are will always outlast what you have.